This is an introduction to the design process as applied to biomimicry. So let's start by defining design approach and design. So in its broadest sense, design can help us integrate a remarkable wealth of very specialized knowledge, but it should not be considered an exclusive field of professionals that call themselves designers. The idea in biomimicry is that really everyone can be a designer. And because we consider design as an activity that connects human intentions to material and cultural expressions. So we see the result of design in the form of products or artifacts, but also in institutions or processes. A design-based approach can be used in many fields. It allows to integrate many different perspectives and disciplines. And this approach is very effective because it not only relies on a sound scientific basis that's informed by systemic thinking, but also considers ethical, aesthetical, social, cultural, economic, and of course ecological intentions. So design can be defined as a human intentionality that's expressed through interactions and relationships. So in this sense, it becomes clear that any change that affects human intentions will redirect the entire design landscape into a more regenerative or sustainable approach. We apply design, or we perform designs to products, like in this case, in this example, a chair that expresses certain functions and aesthetic intentions of the designer, or to whole systems that are also designed to perform certain functions based on a set of intentions. In the case of the chair, the interactions and the relationships are more focused on the different materials and the production processes and the spatial geometries involved, but also include the way the object and its designer, the producer, the distributor, and the user of the chair interact with it. And through the chair, they relate to each other. In the case of services and systems, for example, particular monetary systems, design defines then and shapes the interactions and the relationships between the users of that particular medium of exchange. And we can say that design expresses and creates culture. The design methodology looks slightly different in different fields, but in general it starts with a problem and ends with a solution. And it always involves a stage in which the problem is defined, for example, by researching the needs of the specific users. And then there's usually also a stage where concepts are made, where drafts and prototypes are made, and then a stage of refinement when we perform testing of these drafts, these prototypes, and this is an iterative process that through the testing and the results of those tests will go back to conceptualization or redefining the drafts until we get to a suitable solution. This is a diagram of design thinking that was used by Hasso Plattner, a designer from the Institute of Design at Stanford University. And this shows how biomimicry concepts can fit into the framework of design thinking. Whereas design thinking emphasizes to begin the process with creating or achieving an empathy for the user's needs, in a biomimetic concept, we can extend this concern to include all organisms, to all nature, all forms of life. And then during the define step, then you would identify here the function and the context necessary for the solution and formulate questions for biology research. So this is where you start taking inspiration from natural models. And then in the ideate step or stage, this includes searching biology for inspiration, translating strategies from organisms, and considering life principles, those that we already talked about in previous lectures. And then finally, the test step includes evaluating whether the resulting design is ultimately life-friendly or sustainable. So in its very, very simple form, the design process looks like this, with these three general stages. And in this form, it's applicable to any type of design challenge. So of course, within biomimicry and considering that its ultimate goal is to achieve sustainability, we can start talking about then the concept of regenerative design. The term here, regenerative, describes processes that restore, renew, or revitalize their own sources of energy and materials. So this figure illustrates the different scales of design and how different design approaches reach across these scales to connect them. Regenerative design is a process-oriented whole systems approach to design. So we see that some of the different scales are, for example, starting with the smallest one, the small scale, to design to achieve green chemistry, obtaining, for example, solar energy or energy from the sun, but also using water-based chemistry. Then we can move up a little bit in the hierarchy to designing products and buildings with the goal of increasing their energy efficiency or eliminating waste during the production. Basically all those stages in their life cycle analysis of products. Other larger scales of design, regenerative design, include, for example, industrial ecology, which offers very effective pathways to apply ecological insights to systems of production and consumption. And these approaches all aim to transform our industrial production processes from an open loop to a closed loop. Here again, remember the life cycle analysis and the difference between an open loop or closed loop. Even higher in this scale of design, then we can start talking about urban planning, and this refers to how or the way we can create human settlements based on learning from the patterns of organization and collaboration that we find in ecosystems. So in this lecture, we are not going to talk about each of these scales, but we are going to talk about a little bit more of the principles of design as related to products, designs of products, but a little bit also on industrial design and urban planning. So all design is composed of elements and it follows certain principles, and these principles will vary from field to field of design. The elements then are all the basic building blocks of design. So we can talk about shapes, forms, colors, textures, anything that can be used to produce designs. And the principles then are the methods or the guidelines to use these elements. So, for example, in a very basic, a very simple way, these principles are applied, that are showed in this slide, are applied to visual arts or graphic design or industrial design or even urban planning, using different elements, of course. So these are general principles. The first one is balance. Balance refers to a sense of equality in all the elements of a design, and is recognized by our senses as something beautiful. For example, the facial symmetry in people's faces. Facial symmetry is associated with developmental stability, and we recognize it as beauty. Balance can be symmetrical or asymmetrical, and balance can be also employed or achieved using different colors, like in this photograph, of using dark and light colors. But we can also achieve balance by playing with physical elements, with textures, shapes, or space. The second principle is emphasis. For example, in interior design, on the photo on the right, we see a working area highlighted in yellow, and this area, or the use of this element, this color, points out a place where things happen, where certain activities happen. So there's emphasis on this area. The calculator, on the other hand, we can see that the equal button is the most used, the more often used, and is emphasized through the design by making it in a different color. And in this case, design makes the life of the user much easier, because it's automatically is easier to find. Rhythm refers to a visual tempo or beat in the design, and is achieved, for example, by regular repetition of elements to produce a sense of continuity. So it's achieved, by repetition of elements, or by gradation of colors, for example, by radiation or opposition and transition of certain elements. Unity and harmony refers to all elements of a design, as they relate and complement each other. Only when these elements complement each other can create a single coherent work of piece. A unified design has a consistency, usually of a style. Variety is very closely related to unity. It uses differences of contrasts in elements. In this case, in the example using the iPods, the design is exactly the same, but using the variety of colors, different colors. Each of these iPods is identified by the user as a unit that belongs to the same iPod design or generation of iPods. Movement, of course, is a visual flow in the design. It is the path that the designer intends the viewer or user to follow. It's achieved by placing certain elements in a way that creates a path for the user to interact with the object, or to look at, to peruse the design. Proportion refers to a close relationship between mathematics, basically the proportion of elements such as size, area in which the design will occupy, and is often associated with ergonomics in industrial design. So in this very famous example, the design of the shape of the Coca-Cola bottle it makes use of very well-known proportions that are considered by our senses, or by most people, very aesthetic, very desirable. So when we talk about design for sustainable products, we often then are talking about industrial design more than design that's more strongly based on visual arts. Industrial design is the use of a combination of applied art and applied science to improve the aesthetics and the ergonomics, the marketability and production, but also the functionality of certain products. Some basic principles of industrial design are that it uses or must use simple forms, that the user experience has to be enhanced, and that the design should make a product more effective. An example of an object that follows these principles is this cook stove designed by a Swedish design studio. And it started with a problem, and the problem was that the designers had in mind is that the majority of women in the developing world prepare food on a technology called a three-stone fire. And this is basically three rocks that support a pot with an open fire in the middle. And this cooking method is very inefficient, and it leads to many environmental and health problems. And one very real side effect is that children are denied of education often, because they are sent to collect firewood that they need for the cook stove to be burning most of the time. So the work that these children make take usually all day and leaves no times for school. But on the other hand, this three-stone method is a tradition since thousands of years in many communities. So a new design for a stove must allow the users to keep their way of life intact to be successful, so they can adopt it without interrupting their traditions. So the solution is actually to make a stove that burns wood, but that is very efficient, as efficient as possible. So with this design from the Swedish studio, you can still cook over burning wood, but with this stove you only need a third of the wood that you used before, and it achieves 56% reduction in carbon dioxide, and a 30% reduction on particulate matter. Okay, so we cannot talk about this industrial design without mentioning Dieter Rams. Dieter Rams is a very well known, or if not the best known designer, because it really changed the whole field. He was a young designer in the 70s when he was hired by Braun, a company that didn't really have a very specific or well-defined image. And so he was hired to change the company image. Back then he was very worried by the state of or the principles that designer were following. He thought that most designers were using forms and colors with basically at random, very randomly and very freely. So he asked himself, is my design a good design? And what makes a design a good design? So with that question, he actually set the principles that now sometimes are even called the 10 commandments of design, that define exactly what a good design is. So these principles are now followed by most industrial designers. So in essence, these principles are based on the idea that designs should be innovative, that use elements that have not seen by people before, but products should be functional first. That is the most important aspect of design. Make functional products, and after functionality you can actually increase the aesthetic value of this design. So the first design is that good design is innovative. This all these principles are actually the results of years of experimentation and consulting with other experts, the result of different ideas from different people. So innovation in design, again, using elements that have not seen by people before in a design, which is not very difficult to achieve because technological development is always offering new opportunities for innovative design. A second principle is that good design should make a product very useful. So a product is bought to be used. So it has to satisfy certain criteria, not only functional, but physiological, psychological, and aesthetic. So good design emphasizes the usefulness of a product while it disregards anything that could be possibly detract from it. The third principle is that good design is aesthetic. Aesthetic quality is actually very important for the usefulness of a product because products that we use every day affect our person and our well-being. But not only well executed objects can be beautiful, and a beautiful or aesthetic product will actually be loved and more used, more desired by the user. The fourth principle says that a good design makes a product very easy to use, very understandable. It clarifies the product's structure. Better still, it can make the product even be self-explanatory. The fifth principle is that a good design is unobtrusive. Products fulfill certain purposes, and they should be considered tools. They are not really decorative objects or works of art. Their design should be very neutral and restrained, and to leave room for the user self-expression. A good design is also one that's very honest. It doesn't make a product be misleading. In other words, it only includes elements that are necessary. It doesn't include any elements that might make the product look like something else, like a different product. This principle refers to the idea that long-lasting products are actually more useful, and it avoids being fashionable, and therefore it never really feels antiquated. So it, unlike like very fashionable design, it lasts for decades. So a single product it doesn't need to be replaced very often. The next principle of design is that designs should be very thorough and pay attention to all details. So nothing in the design must be arbitrary or left to chance. Every element considered has a purpose. Care and accuracy in the design process actually show respect towards the user. This principle actually is very getting very close to what we consider sustainable. Good design should be environmentally friendly, and a good design makes important contribution to the preservation of the environment, but it also conserves resources and minimizes physical and visual pollution through all the stages of their life cycle. The 10th principle of design is that actually there should be as little design as possible. The idea is that less but better design, because the design should concentrate on using essential aspects, and the products are not really burdened with non-essentials. So it's really taking design back to simplicity, but while keeping functionality. Okay, so now we are moving a little bit higher in the scale of regenerative design and the framework that we saw at the beginning. And so we can talk just a little bit about urban design. This is a complex topic, so it's actually beyond the scope of the course to delve too much into this, but it is worth mentioning because urban design principles are really guidelines that a whole city adopts to direct a long-term strategy of development. So they will determine the pathway that to sustainability that a whole city can follow. Urban designers like architectural firms and neighborhoods adopt principles to guide their contribution to urban design. The principle that they follow is that people can or should live, work, and receive basic services all within their neighborhood. Some of the elements of urban design that are different to the design that we talked about already are, in this case, that we are not dealing with shapes and textures, but at a larger scale we're talking about buildings and public spaces, streets, transport, and landscape. So one of the first principles is that resilient cities and neighborhoods need to embrace the density, the diversity, and the mix of users, and of different building types and different public spaces. A second principle is that cities should prioritize walking as the preferred mode of travel, and as even a defining component of a healthy quality of life, to be able to walk everywhere that you want as a user. Another principle is that has the idea that resilient cities and neighborhoods will develop in a way that's transit supportive. Cities should also focus energy and resources on conserving and enhancing and creating strong and vibrant places where people can actually live and develop and enjoy. These spaces, these vital spaces or essential spaces, are a significant component of the neighborhood structure and of the community's identity. So these essential spaces are very important. Another principle is mentions that resilient neighborhoods will provide the needs of daily living within walking distance. So if cities are designed following this principle, we are actually enhancing the idea of local economy, because an inhabitant or a citizen can actually perform everything, fulfill all the needs in his life without the need of even having a car or even public transportation. Another principle of urban design, is that cities should enhance the efficiency, the effectiveness and safety of their technical and industrial systems and processes, including their manufacturing, their transportation, communication, and construction of infrastructures. And reduce, of course, while reducing their environmental footprint. So this is refers to the integrated technical and industrial design systems. Okay, so in biomimicry, of course, we look at nature as model and inspiration for design guidelines, to draw those guidelines. our principles. So in these next slides, I will just present a very few examples of natural forms or strategies and a simplified way or point of view from which a designer would start translating those strategies into useful guidelines for design. In our next lecture, after the shopping experience, we actually are going to do some exercises looking at how we translate those principles, those guidelines or strategies obtained from nature into a language that these designers or engineers actually understand. So the first example is of different species of moths which build a cocoon that have a very particular function. That function is resisting ice formation. The strategy here is that the moths use an oral secretion that line the inside of the moth's cocoon and prevents moisture from penetrating the cocoon and allowing ice crystals forming. So this fine lining of material prevents moisture penetration and ice formation. So a designer could actually look at this natural strategy and think, okay, an object is covered with some sort of fine lining like a dry webbing that prevents moisture penetration and formation. Another example here is of these springtails, which operate or live in extreme cold environments or conditions. And the way they do it or achieve this is they use a protective dehydration method to survive harsh winters. So water is lost from their body across the diffusion gradient, and so they actually they cool down their body fluids and their eye surroundings. So the principle abstracted that could be useful in design is should be understanding how these creatures accumulate these antifreeze compounds to lower the temperature at which their body freezes. The following example is the red mangrove. Their biological function, it's the presence of a membrane that works as a filtration membrane actually. So mangroves grow in environments that are basically between salt and freshwater areas, and so these membranes or the tissues in their stems help desalinate water from the ocean. The roots actually allow water and nutrient intake, but exclude salt that otherwise would kill the roots of normal plants, for example. So the design that could be extracted from this is the use of a permeable and impermeable membrane to allow what we need in and excluding what is not wanted. The example of the Suriname toad is also of a function, and it's also a kind of membrane in a more engineering using more engineering terms. So in this case, the skin of the toad acts as or serves as a nest for the babies, for their offspring. So it protects them, so it provides mechanical protection, physical protection, and holds them until they are fully developed. While the skin is tough enough to hold the babies and provide mechanical protection, it also allows them to grow, and when the offspring are ready to pop out, when they are strong enough, they actually break the skin. So the design principle that can be abstracted is an impermeable wall from one side, but with the ability to break through as needed from the other. In this example of the spider, we are also talking about membranes. You will see many examples in nature of very useful membranes, multifunctional membranes. In this case, the spiders use a series of rings along the walls of their burrows, and these are burrowing spiders, therefore the name. These walls are not impermeable, but they can hold very small particles in place that even humans would struggle with. The walls are very easily patched or rebuilt, so they are regenerated very easily. So the design principle, it would be a lightweight, simple and strong support system to hold back materials without being completely impermeable. So these principles that I am telling you about were actually thought of by a designer. So it's starting to use language that a biologist would not normally use, but that you will actually see that when you talk to engineers or designers, it's necessary to find that common ground to start abstracting important principles that will guide the design process. Okay, just one of the last few examples is the woodpecker, and in this case the function is the absorption of shock. So you're familiar with the fact that woodpeckers obviously peck on wood, and the force that they use while they do this is remarkable. So their skulls have evolved protective systems that are very, very interesting. So they can hit very, very strongly with very strong force the wood. So their body is designed for this movement. Design meaning has evolved for this movement. So they brace themselves using their tails, and they take advantage of their center of gravity and the configuration or the structure of the bone of their skull to absorb considerable stress. So actually there's a lot of research being done on trying to emulate the structure of the skull, to recreate, to try to abstract this design principle, to absorb the shock and provide. And actually there's already a commercial design for a helmet for cyclists based on the structure of the shock absorption function of the skull of the woodpecker. Okay, the last example is the hedgehog, and it is a similar function. Hedgehogs, and specifically their spines or their hairs, are really good at absorbing shock. Hedgehogs, and the way they have evolved this function, because their predators will actually try to crush them. So their design, the principle that can be extracted is the structure of the spines themselves, or their hairs. So these structures absorb the force of a blow, for example, and minimize the damage to the organisms, or in this case of a product. Okay, so just to finish, I would like you to have a look at this video by one of the designers that I normally follow very closely. She does very interesting work, and she's a designer and an architect at MIT. In this particular video, she she gives very very good insights into the bridge between biology and technology and innovation, using design as a tool. So it will give you a better idea of the importance of the work of designers for biomimicry. So watch it, and we will eventually we will discuss it and some of the hair designs during class.